All right, well, again, welcome. My name is Stephanie. I'm with the Scientist in Every Florida School program, and today we're stepping into the garden, our virtual series presented by Mounts Botanical Garden and Scientist in Every Florida School. Today's Into the Garden event, Ecosystem Engineers will take a brief look at the current exhibit happening now, Nature Pop, at Mounts Botanical Garden. This nature-inspired exhibit is engineered with hundreds of thousands of Lego pieces. And as such, we were inspired to look at how animals act as engineers in nature. Scientist in Every Florida School is a free program housed within the Thompson Earth Systems Institute at the University of Florida. The CEFS program has a mission to engage Florida K-12 teachers and students in cutting-edge research by providing science role models and experiences like today, hopefully to inspire future stewards of our planet. Mounts Botanical Garden, our partner, is a nationally acclaimed attraction for Florida residents and visitors alike, with a mission to inspire and educate through nature. I'm going to pass things over to April now from Mounts Botanical Garden to tell us a little bit more about their space and, of course, the Nature Pop exhibit. April?
Thank you, Stephanie. Hi, everyone. So welcome to Mounts Botanical Garden. If you come to Mounts Botanical Garden, you will see 25 unique display gardens with over 5,000 different species of plants that are subtropical and tropical in nature. So what you're looking at right now on the left, this is one of our gardens. It's called Windows on the Floating World. And as you can see, it is a wetlands garden. We have other gardens, we have an herb garden, we have a vegetable garden, and we welcome you to come and visit. We are open 6 days a week from 9 until 4. Stephanie, do you want to do the other slide? And right now, our display, our exhibit that we have going on is called Nature Pop. And we have over 40 different sculptures. They are comprised of Legos. The artist Sean Kenney made each sculpture out of Lego pieces. He's an award-winning artist, and we are very lucky to have all of these sculptures in the garden right now for you to see. These sculptures blend art and science and innovation. They're bigger than life, and just as Lego bricks interconnect, we're asking today, how is everything else in nature interconnected? So with that, we have a very special presenter right now, Clancy, and she's going to talk to us about the interconnection in nature. Kara?
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint. So today I'm going to be talking to you all about ecosystem engineers, but first I wanted to take a moment to thank our sponsors. I am a student in the Wildlife Ecology and Conservation Department at the University of Florida, and I wanted to thank the Thompson Earth Systems Institute and Mounts Botanical Garden of Palm Beach County for having me here today. If you have a chance to check out that exhibit, it is really cool. And one of the fun things is that it's actually featuring some of the animals that I'm talking to you about here today. So before we get into ecosystem engineers, I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Clancy, and I'm a scientist, but I'm also a student. Much like many of you, I am in school. I'm still learning. I graduated with my bachelor's degree in 2020 from the Wildlife Ecology and Conservation Department at the University of Florida, but I am now a master's student. My research is centered around an invasive species of lizard called the Argentine tegu, and I'm looking at how it interacts with native mammal species. But I haven't always worked with reptiles. I've actually worked with bats, birds, bugs, and just about everything in between. One of the coolest things that I got to work on was ecosystem engineers, species like woodpeckers and now gopher tortoises that I study to try to understand how they interact with the environment. And so before we get into ecosystem engineers, we need to talk about what makes an ecosystem engineer and what it is. And there's 3 facets to this. The first is that they modify or maintain their habitat. The second is that they impact species richness or the number of species in an area. And the third is that they're important to maintaining community function, What that means is that the community requires that animal in order to keep it intact and working properly the way that it should. And so let's look at this in the case of the beaver. The beaver is an animal that you can find throughout the eastern United States, but they are only in the northernmost part of Florida, but they're hailed as this classic ecosystem engineer. The reason for this is because they build something called a dam. It's a bunch of logs stacked together that can stop or reroute water. And what that does is drastically alter the ecosystem. They provide a lot of ecosystem function purposes, such as rerouting waterways to move them out of areas, which can help things, help the ecosystem stay as a meadow versus being underwater, which is very important for terrestrial wildlife. They can also prevent flooding. So in the cases of storms, these dams actually slow down water flow and prevent the water from searing over into the ecosystem. One of the last facets they provide is filtering the water. These dams are stacked up so that the water has to flow through them. And what this does is pull out all of the sediments and rocks and kind of crud that builds up in the water and makes it mucky. It keeps that water in great condition, which then benefits the plants. The plants can grow better when they have more sunlight. It helps the herbivores that feed on those plants, and it has a cascading effect throughout the ecosystem. These dams also, on the superficial level, provide habitat for animals, and all of these reasons combined actually make them something called a keystone species. That means that they're important for the ecosystem to function, and if they weren't there, we would actually see a complete change in the ecosystem, both in the types of species there, as well as the type of habitat that it becomes. Their habitats would become flooded and uncontrollable if the beavers weren't there to save the day. And so we have talked about a species that's in the northernmost part of Florida. What do we have throughout Florida? Well, the first ecosystem engineer is the woodpecker. These are one of my favorite animals because they're all over the state, but usually underappreciated. A lot of people view them as annoying because they make a lot of noise when they're pecking into woods. Sometimes they like to peck into our houses, but the reality is that these are ecosystem engineers. When they were living in nature, they provide this role where they excavate holes for food. They put their head into the trees and peck with their bills. And what this does is actually, in the process of looking for food, knock down a bunch of bark and sediment from the trees that then goes into the soil and can be broken down into nutrients by detritivores or animals that feed on those parts. And once they're broken down, those become nutrients for other things to feed on. And so it provides food for the plants that have their roots in the soil and can absorb those nutrients. The herbivores can again feed on those plants. The carnivores can feed on the herbivores. And it has huge impacts for the ecosystem that all starts with the woodpecker. Something else that the woodpeckers do is that they actually excavate cavities in the trees when they're nesting. These cavities are really important for dozens of bird species throughout the state and even flying squirrels. Some of the birds that benefit from these nesting sites include eastern screech owls, the American kestrel, which is a tiny bird of prey that, fun fact, we have the only non-migratory population of in my portion of Florida near Gainesville. And also the songbirds that we love so much, things like bluebirds and cardinals love these cavities to nest in. Woodpeckers are something called a primary excavator. So every year they're gonna burrow into a tree, make a nesting cavity, and then the next year they'll make a new one so that old one is available to use for any birds coming through the area. Without these nesting cavities, birds' nests would be vulnerable to things like predators. And so they play a really important role by engineering the ecosystem with holes in trees. And you might be wondering, how do they do this? Well, they are built to be ecosystem engineers. They are actually built at the anatomical level in their skulls to protect themselves from beating into those trees. A woodpecker can hit a tree up to 20 times per second. If you try to shake your head around, I promise you, you could not move it that fast. If you did, you'd probably get a headache. You'd feel your brain rattling around. Woodpeckers do not have that problem. This is because woodpeckers have skulls made from spongy bone. If you think of a sponge and you squeeze it, it springs back, no problem, right? And that's because the holes in the sponge allow it to absorb shock and spring back. Woodpecker skulls are the same way. When they're shaking back and forth, those little holes or perforations in the skull allow them to recover from the shock of hitting the tree. Something else that's really cool about them is they have built-in padding in their skull. So they have muscles in the neck to absorb shock when they're moving back and forth. If you try shaking your head back and forth, you're gonna feel it in your neck. Woodpeckers do not have that problem. And they also have this very crazy tongue that wraps around their skull. You can see it going all the way back towards the eyeballs. This serves as a pillow. It cushions the brain, it keeps it safe while they're doing that rocking. And fun fact, the tongue actually has a barb at the tip so that when they're hunting for bugs, they can use it like a fishing line and reel into that bug, catch it, hook it, and eat it. It's really crazy. Woodpeckers are not to be underestimated. And I like to call them bird-brained. I don't mean that they're not smart, but what I do mean is that they have special skulls that are adapted to moving back and forth. So their skulls are actually smaller to keep the brain in place. There's no way for it to rattle around in there. And that's because they move their head back and forth so repeatedly. And they do this boring into something called a snag. So what's a snag, right? That's just a fancy word for a standing dead or dying tree. It's terminology that we use in wildlife biology to tell the difference between a potential nesting tree or something that is living and likely to not be excavated into. The ideal snag for a woodpecker is hard on the outside and soft in the center. They do this because it actually creates a really nice little safe haven for the birds to stay in that's not too rough on them while they're growing up. And so snags are really essential habitat for woodpeckers and many other bird species, including those beautiful songbirds that we love so much. You can actually see in this photo, that's me. And what I have is a camera that is attached to a 30-foot pole. I can expand that pole up and down as I need to look inside of the snag into that little cavity the woodpeckers made. And I was looking for baby woodpeckers to see if they were nesting in that area. In this particular snag, they were. And so I'm looking at them on a tiny screen and seeing them grow up, and it is very cool. Snags are a very underestimated part of the ecosystem, but they're so important for so many bird species. And you can actually keep them on your property as long as you have an inspector come in and make sure that they don't pose a risk to the infrastructure. And fun fact, if you have any sick or dying trees, you can hire an arborist to come in, cut off all those branches in the top of the tree to make sure that it is safe to have around. And if you leave it there, you will find life in the death of that tree because many birds will move in and raise their young in there. And it is a wonderful thing to do as long as you're allowed to do it and you don't have a homeowners association that restricts it. And so we're going to get our head out of the clouds now and move in from trees to burrows. And we'll start with this really cute animal called the pocket gopher. If you look at the photo on the top right, you can see these little sandy mounds, and that's actually where they get their name sandy mounders from. Over time, this name has evolved into salamanders. And so over time, people have started to think that these mounds are made by salamanders, which are a type of small amphibian that actually will use and stay in these burrows, but they are not made by them. They're made by this cute guy on the bottom. And pocket gophers are really amazing animals because all of these little mounds are entrances and exits to a really elaborate tunnel system. They can form tunnel systems up to 500 feet in length, which is hard to imagine such a little animal doing, but they do it to stay safe from predators. And in turn, dozens upon dozens of animals use this as shelter. They form something called a refugia, or a safe place for animals to hide from. It protects the animals from the elements, but what it also does is that it stays warm in the winter and cold in the summer. And so animals will go in here to chill out or warm up depending on the weather outside. And it is really helpful for keeping animals safe as well. Something else that these pocket gophers do is that they mix up soil while burrowing, and it cycles nutrients throughout the ecosystem. So those woodpeckers that I talked about earlier that are putting things to the ground, the pocket gophers are taking all of those nutrients that break down and cycling through, because where do roots for plants go? They go deep into the ground, but where are all the nutrients? Up at the top. So pocket gophers are doing this really cool blending effect where they're bringing all those nutrients down so that the plants can access them. And where pocket gophers are found, we actually see increases in plant diversity, or the number of plant species in an area, because they're making those nutrients accessible to different types of plants, which is a really great ecosystem service. Unfortunately, because they make these kind of unsightly mounds, they're usually viewed as a pest. And so we've seen reductions throughout their populations in the southeast. They are potentially at risk for extinction if We continue developing at the level that we're developing at for homes and things like that. So the next time that you see a pocket gopher mound, maybe think about the beautiful community that they're building underneath the ground instead of the kind of unsightly nature of those mounds up top. And so while on the topic of gophers, we have another ecosystem engineer and probably the most notable one here in the state of Florida. Gopher tortoises. This is another species found throughout the Southeast, and it's actually our only native tortoise species here in Florida. And they are one of the most important ecosystem engineers that we have here. They build burrows in a habitat called longleaf pine forests. And these longleaf pine forests are some of the most biodiverse habitat that we have here, not only here in the state, but in the entire world. Longleaf pine forests have some of the highest biodiversity or number of species that we can see anywhere. And so gopher tortoises are actually a lot to thank for this. They build burrows up to 40 feet long and 10 feet deep. And similar to the pocket gophers, it's a refugia. It stays cold in the summer and warm in the winter, and animals can find comfort in it. What's really amazing is that there have been more than 300 species found in these burrows. That's hard to imagine, but like it's probably more people than you can have in a single classroom or auditorium. And that's the number of species, not even the number of animals. Unfortunately, much like the gopher tortoise, they are also declining throughout their range. We're seeing less and less gopher tortoises because we're developing on their land. The average gopher tortoise can take 10 years to reach maturity and mate, and up to 60 years for its entire life to play out. They require a lot of habitat in order to survive and persist in healthy numbers. And unfortunately, that habitat is quickly dwindling as we build houses and homes in these neighborhoods. So they are currently a state threatened species. They have protections in place to try to keep their populations up, but we're still seeing declines, and hopefully that trend can offset over time. But those 300 species that I mentioned also depend on them, and they have a name. They're a commensal species, or a living thing that uses another living thing for survival. Some of the species that you can find in these burrows include gopher frogs, eastern diamondback rattlesnakes, scarab beetles, whip scorpions, cotton mice, gopher crickets, and eastern indigo snakes, which are actually a protected species in Florida. I could list all 300 species, but we would run out of time. And so instead, what I want to do is show you some of my favorites. You can see some of the herps here, or reptiles and amphibians. We have an eastern diamondback rattlesnake and the pine snake that I mentioned earlier. We also have the gopher frog, which is a personal favorite of mine because they're named after the gopher tortoise and occurring in their burrows so frequently. And that is another protected species here in Florida. We see a lot of reptiles and amphibians in gopher tortoise burrows because they're cold-blooded. And so they rely on the outside environment in order to keep their body heat to digest food and things like that. By going into those tortoise burrows, they make sure that they don't get too hot or too cold, but stay in a nice, right temperature. And it helps protect them, especially from really hot weather or really cold weather, which as a cold-blooded animal, they really need. But what you'll see in these photos is that there's also mammals. These are warm-blooded animals. They produce their own body heat. They can cool themselves down. And so you might be wondering, why do they need burrows? Well, at the end of the day, it takes energy to keep your temperature at a constant rate. So if it's really hot out and you need to be cooler, you're burning a lot of energy, sweating, trying to get your temperature back down. When they go into gopher tortoise burrows, they don't burn as much energy because those temperatures are optimal for them. And if you're burning less energy, that means you don't have to eat as much, you don't have to hunt as much, and as a wild animal, that makes a world of difference. So these 300 species are benefiting immensely from the gopher tortoise burrows. One of the really cool things we learned about these commensal species, the ones that benefit, well, there are obligate commensals in gopher tortoises. In fact, there's 14 of them. What an obligate commensal is it's a species that absolutely needs that other species to survive. Without it, they would go extinct because their life history depends on it. The 14 species are all invertebrates, or types of bugs that depend on the gopher tortoise, and a lot of them are smaller than the size of a penny. The funny thing for me is that most of them are actually dung beetles, and so there's a dozen species that entirely depend on gopher tortoise poop to survive, which is kind of crazy to think about. But these obligate commensals are unique to gopher tortoises, and so if we lose the gopher tortoises, we lose 14 other species along with them. And so these ecosystem engineers are so important to biodiversity and keeping animals safe. And so I just threw a lot of information at you guys. I just want to recap the different ecosystem engineers we talked about. The first is that woodpeckers provide nesting habitat for many birds. And the second is that pocket gophers and gopher tortoises provide refugia, or a safe place with a constant temperature through their burrows. And while you're going through the course of the day, while you're walking around and seeing different animals, I want you to think, are there any other animals that may engineer the environment? How are these animals interacting? What are they depending on? If you see a bird in a tree, what's it doing in that tree? Just kind of start to evaluate the world around you, and you'll start to see things differently. And so with that, here's a picture of an eastern screech owl that I used to work with. They actually will nest in woodpecker cavities, so a little fun fact for you. And I'll open it up to any questions.
Thanks so much, Kira. That was an excellent presentation. I know I've learned quite a bit, and I'm sure our students on the presentation on the call have as well. So if anybody has any questions, please write them in the chat. We already have quite a few questions from our viewers today, so we're just going to jump right into it. Our first question is, are butterflies ecosystems engineers?
So butterflies are not ecosystem engineers, but they are keystone species. They don't modify the environment that they're going through necessarily. They're not building any structures like burrows or dams, but what they are doing is going from plants to pollinate them. And so they're helping plants spread around. They're helping change the community of plants by how they pollinate and spread seeds and things like that. And so while they're not ecosystem engineers, they're still very important for the way that ecosystems function.
Great, thank you. Next, are snapping tortoises found in burrows?
The snapping tortoises actually have been found in burrows. Pretty much every reptile that you can think of here in Florida has been in a gopher tortoise burrow at one point or another, but snapping tortoises especially seem to really like the warmth that it provides in the winter.
We're getting a ton of just examples of questions and how they impact. Are they engineers? Our next one, let's do is, do pocket gophers hibernate?
So pocket gophers do not necessarily hibernate in Florida because it stays nice and warm for them. But what they will do is hunker down into their burrows, still be active in those burrows, moving through underground where it's nice and warm. They won't come to the surface in the winter where it's really cold, but they're still out and about, moving, eating, and doing all the things that a pocket gopher does.
Great, thank you. And then from another student, can you tell us a little bit more about the tongues of woodpeckers and how they work? For example, a student said, are woodpecker tongues like hooks, or how exactly do they function?
Yeah, so woodpecker tongues are really cool because they're this multi-purpose tool. They protect the skull, but what they also do is they kind of go out like a whip. They go out like this, and they're going into the tree, into those holes that they're making to try and fish out insects. So they're poking into this hole, going like this, and at the tip, there's a little barb. And what that barb does is it pulls those bugs out and reels them back into the mouth. And they can do that repeatedly up to 20 times in a second. So it's really efficient for hunting.
What is the difference between a turtle and a tortoise in the ecosystem?
So this is a fun fact. Turtles are often said to be aquatic, but we have things like box turtles that live on land. What it is basically, it's a taxonomy thing. So it's the classification of animals, how we group them. All tortoises are turtles. Turtles are this big overarching group, but not all turtles are tortoises. A good way to usually tell the difference is that tortoises will have more domed shells and that they have flat feet.
Great, thank you. How do animals respond once their environment has been changed or engineered to a different way? Can they go back to the way they lived before?
Yeah, so when we have an ecosystem engineer in place, what we usually see is an increase in biodiversity. You'll get more species represented. And so those animals can still possibly persist unless it's things like beavers that are turning aquatic systems into terrestrial systems, right? But if we were to take those ecosystem engineers out of the ecosystem, things would go back to the way they were before that ecosystem engineer was present. And so those animals would still be able to persist after the fact.
Thank you so much. Next, we have, what can be done to protect pocket gophers?
So one of the best things that we can do on the individual scale is let pocket gophers live in our yards. They actually occur a lot in residential neighborhoods, and people will choose to remove them. But if you don't remove them, it gives them the chance to persist and live in your yard and create that little beautiful community of all those animals that I mentioned earlier.
Do animals stay in the holes or burrows for living or breeding, or do they stay there full time, or what is the purpose?
So animals will actually move in and out of those burrows. What it is usually shelter. So think of like, if it's raining, you don't want to be outside, so you go under a tent or a cover, right? That's kind of the same function that burrows serve. Or if it's cold, you go into a warm place. That's what the burrows are doing for the animals. In a healthy ecosystem, there's a lot of burrows. And so you don't have to go back to that same burrow every time. You can move between them. And that's why gopher tortoises and having a lot of them are important, because it gives a lot of burrows, a lot of safe places to hide, so that we don't have to say, if it was raining, all cram under one tent, 300 people.
Sort of speaking of places to hide, we have a question. Is it true that we need predators to keep populations of animals not too high or not too low?
Yes, predators are one of the most important things that we can have in an ecosystem. A great example is Yellowstone National Park actually took out all of the wolves were removed through hunting. And what we saw was that things like elk and deer were stripping the trees. There was nothing left, no greenery. And when we put the wolves back into Yellowstone, we saw all of that green come back because the wolves were keeping those herbivores in check.
What is your favorite animal that helps the environment?
Oh, that's a hard question. I love gopher tortoises. They're just the cutest little animals. All they do is walk around and eat and dig burrows. And I really respect that about them. They like know their purpose in life and just kind of loiter through.
How many ecosystem engineers are there?
That's a hard question, and it depends on who you ask. Some people would argue that every animal is an ecosystem engineer in one way, because when you remove one animal, it has impacts. But really, I would say that the core ecosystem engineers are the gopher tortoise, the pocket gopher, and the woodpeckers, as far as Florida ecosystems go.
Do animals that go into burrows eat other animals that are in the burrows?
Yes. So I mentioned, I showed in my photo the commensal species. There's actually a gray fox and a marsh rabbit. That's a great example of an animal that's a predator and an animal that's prey that could both be in the same burrow. And that is absolutely a possibility, is getting eaten.
Why do animals hibernate?
Animals hibernate because it gets too cold outside to be safely active. I mentioned that you use a lot of energy when you're trying to keep yourself warm. If you think of the coldest day, that's a lot of energy to spend. And in the winter, there's not a lot of food around. And so hibernating is a way to not have to eat a ton to stay active. Instead, you can hunker down, keep all of your fat deposits before the winter and work through them by not doing anything, and then come out better on the other end in spring.
That makes sense. Thank you. We have time for just a few more questions. How do animals notice when something is coming towards them and they need to respond?
So this is a really fun thing called the landscape of fear response. It's basically an animal will either learn what a predator does and learn to avoid it so they don't get eaten, or they'll get eaten. And what happens is that you have these animals that are learning to avoid those behaviors breeding. And so that behavior stays within the population and helps them learn for the future. And there's a whole study called sensory ecology that talks about how animals perceive the environment and how they would understand these cues. And it depends from each animal. Every animal sees the world differently.
All right, so maybe just two more. There's so many questions. Like I have over 100 just waiting to be read. I wish we had all day just to go through them together and answer every student's questions. Our next one would be if, for example, a bird gets injured. If something happens to its wings, could the bird heal itself or repair itself and then fly again? Or is it similar to with other animals that they're able to help themselves?
Yeah, so birds are an especially tricky one because wings don't just have to heal to get better, they have to heal right. If they can't fly. But what often happens with injured birds is that they get brought to wildlife rehabilitation centers where professionals who are trained in how to take care of these animals can help those wings heal right. And if it's done properly, they can go back into the environment, be able to fly and persist just like they were before those wings were injured.
All right, well, let's wrap up with one more. And this question is just I'm interested in your advice. If any of the over 400 students today that are in our attendance are also interested in going to a science career path or becoming a scientist, what advice would you give them?
My main advice is to just let your passion drive you. When I was a student, I was reading every book under the sun about animals. I was talking to anybody I could find about them. And what had actually happened was I went to my local nature center to talk to somebody, and that's how I started this route. And so the best thing you can do, learn as much as you can, talk to as many people as you can, and I have no doubt that you could be a scientist too.
Well, with that, thank you so much for this amazing conversation and opportunity to teach so many students. I'm going to turn things over to Stephanie to wrap up.
Thanks, Brian. And thanks, Kara. Amazing and engaging as always. We really appreciate you and your time and your expertise. Be sure to visit us next time on April 12th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time for Bats as Pollinators. And we'd love for you to take a quick moment to fill out the survey you see here on your screen. And it's also been placed in the chat box, although I'm sure it's probably buried at this point in time. We would love your feedback. And finally, you can learn more information about Mounts Botanical Garden and Scientists in Every Florida School by visiting our website seen here on the screen, as well as following us on social media. We have recorded today's session and have curated K-12 resources and extension activities for the classroom. You can find that on our YouTube channel. And with that, we'd like to say thank you again and have a great day. Hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.